The pen did not shake in her hand. That, more than anything, was what the solicitor would remember of the 11th of September. That the woman signing a deed, which made her mistress of one of the largest estates in the county, held the pen the way she might hold a needle, steady, unhurried, entirely without theater. £912. That was the figure written in the corner of the settlement, the notional value assigned to what the document called services rendered in the restoration and audit of estate accounts, October to September, 11 months complete. No one in the room believed the figure told the whole truth, least of all the man standing at her shoulder, watching her sign with the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed a sentence for a very long time and is not yet ready to say it. She wore gray, dove-gray wool, turned once at the cuff, mended twice at the hem, the same gown, unmistakably, that she had worn 11 months before in this same hall, in front of these same tall windows, when the room had been full of creditors' clerks, and cold tea, and a duke's temper. The butler stood near the door, as he always stood, having stood there, in one capacity or another, for 41 years, and he alone in the room seemed unsurprised by any of it, not the deed, not the dress, not the silence stretching between the two people at the table like a held breath. The solicitor cleared his throat and slid the second copy forward. Her name, Your Grace, as joint holder, as you instructed. The Duke did not look at the paper, he looked at the gown. It would take some unwinding, this business, how a bookbinder's daughter, with one good dress and no fortune, had come to sit at that table at all. How a dying dowager's quiet suspicion of her own steward had set in motion 11 months that ended here, in September, with ink drying on a settlement, dressed up to look like ordinary estate business, so that a proud woman might accept it without flinching. It would take going backward through months of ledgers and lies, and rain on gravel, to understand why the same gown that had once been called charity work in this very hall was now being worn on purpose, needle marks and all, as though she wished him to see them. For now, only this, the pen set down, the ink drying, a hand, his, resting near hers on the deed's edge, close enough to feel the warmth of her knuckles, not quite touching. I called it charity once, he said, low enough that only she and the butler heard it. I was wrong about the dress. He did not finish the thought. Outside, September light moved across the gravel drive exactly as October rain once had, 11 months before, on the morning this had truly begun, though no one in that hall yet knew to call it a beginning. 11 months, that was the sum of it, if one wished to reduce a year of ruin and repair to a figure on a page, the way she had been trained to reduce all things, grief, debt, deception, to columns that could be checked against one another, until they balanced or confessed their falseness. 11 months back from that September morning stood October, and October stood in rain. The narrator's ledger, if such a thing existed, would record it thus. October the 14th. Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe, dead of a failing heart, aged 61. Estate debts unknown but suspected considerable. One steward, 23 years in service, above suspicion by every account save the dead woman's own. She had not been in the room when the dowager breathed her last. She had been in her father's old workshop 3 miles distant, mending the spine of a parish register for 4 shillings, unaware that a woman she had met only twice, once to discuss a torn Book of Common Prayer, once to be paid for it in coin counted twice for honesty's sake, had spoken her name to a solicitor with instructions sealed until after the funeral. The instructions, when opened, were brief. Send for the bookbinder's daughter, tell no one what she is hired to do, pay her from my private accounts, not the estate's. It was the last clause that mattered most, though no one understood why until much later. Not the solicitor who read it aloud with faint puzzlement, not the steward who heard of it second-hand and felt the first cold prickle of a fear he mastered quickly, and certainly not the woman herself, who took the commission, believing it concerned nothing more than water-damaged bindings in a neglected library. She arrived at Ashcombe on the 22nd of October, in rain that had not stopped for 3 days, wearing a gray wool cloak turned twice at the collar and boots that let the wet through at the left heel. The butler admitted her through the servants' entrance without being told to. An instinct 41 years of service had sharpened past the need for instruction. He noted, and later remembered noting, that she thanked him for it, a small courtesy so rare among the estate's recent visitors that he mentioned it to no one, only filed it away the way he filed everything, patiently, for a use he could not yet name. She was given a room off the library, a stack of ledgers bound in cracked calf, and a candle allowance she did not exceed. She was not introduced to the Duke, who was then in London settling a matter of unpaid interest, and would not be for another 11 weeks. She did not know his face. She knew, within 4 days, that the estate's rent rolls did not add. That discrepancy, small at first, a matter of pounds, not yet the 4,000 it would become, was where the true story began, though she would not recognize it as a beginning for some time yet. By the second week she had learned the estate's rhythms, as she once learned the rhythms of her father's bindery, which floorboards spoke, which doors stuck in damp weather, which hour the kitchen fires were banked. She worked from 6 until the candle guttered, and she kept her own private register alongside the estate's, a habit inherited, not invented, from a man who had taught her that every number wanted a witness. October the 9th, rents recorded for the home farm did not match rents she found scratched, in a different hand, on a torn receipt tucked behind the flyleaf of the oldest ledger. £11, 4 shillings, unaccounted. October the 14th, a second discrepancy, £17, in the tenant rolls for the eastern cottages. Neither sum was large enough to alarm a careless audit, but a careless audit was precisely what the estate had suffered for 11 years, and she had not come to Ashcombe to be careless. October the 17th, she began a third column in her private register, one the Dowager had never requested, headed simply, Pattern. She had learned from her father that a single missing shilling was an accident, but a missing shilling that recurred on the same date each quarter was a design. She ruled the page as he had taught her to rule the boards of a binding, plumb, patient, no waste of line, and into it she set every discrepancy by date, by sum, by the hand that had recorded it. The hand troubled her most. It was not the Dowager's copperplate, nor the current steward's cramped, hurried scrawl. It was older, careful, almost proud of itself, as though whoever held the pen believed no one would ever trouble to look behind the flyleaf of a ledger already 40 years retired from use. She said nothing of it in the servants' hall, where the housekeeper's tea had grown, by the third week, only slightly less bitter toward her. She said nothing to the butler, though she noticed he had begun leaving the library, fire lit an hour longer than strict economy allowed, and she understood this as its own kind of testimony. She said nothing, above all, to the steward, who visited the library twice that week under the pretext of counting inkwells, and once under no pretext at all, simply standing in the doorway long enough to note which ledgers lay open upon her table before wishing her a pleasant evening and withdrawing. By October the 22nd, the sum in her private column had reached £41, 9 shillings, modest still, the kind of figure a comfortable house might lose to carelessness and never miss. But her father had bound estate ledgers for 30 years before his eyes failed him, and he had told her once, mending a spine by candlelight, that thieves who are patient steal small, and thieves who are patient steal long, and it is only the long that ever adds to a fortune worth hanging for. She did not yet have a fortune. She had £41, and a hand she could not place, and a private register no one else knew existed, ruled as carefully as any binding she had ever restored for a paying customer, though this customer was dead 6 months and could no longer thank her for the work. She banked the candle at 11 that night, as she had every night that week, and sat a moment longer in the dark than the cold justified, turning over in her mind not the sums but the dates, quarter days, always quarter days, until the pattern, still faint, still unproven, began to resemble something with teeth. By the 4th week of December, the pattern had teeth enough to bite. She had learned, by then, to read Ashcombe's ledgers the way her father had taught her to read a damaged spine, not by what was written, but by what had been trimmed away to hide the tear. 4 quarter days, 4 years apart, showed rents entered at figures that did not match the tenant rolls kept separately in the steward's own hand, rolls he had not thought to burn because he did not know she had found them, tucked behind a false board in the estate room press where old leases went to die. November the 19th, a farm at Hollow Reach, let at £11 on the roll, entered in the ledger at 9. March the 25th, the year before, a mill tenancy, let at 17, entered at 14. Small sums, careful sums. The kind a comfortable house loses to carelessness and never troubles to ask after, which was, she understood now, precisely the arithmetic the steward had built his life upon. She did not confront him. She had not yet earned the right to be believed over a man who had managed Ashcombe for a decade and dined, on Sundays, at the housekeeper's own table. Instead, she copied each discrepancy into her private register in a hand, so plain and so patient that, had anyone found the book, they would have thought it the work of a much older woman, or a much colder one. The steward, for his part, had begun to notice her. Not with suspicion, not yet, but with the particular attention a man pays a servant he has not yet decided how to use. He brought her, one wet Tuesday, a plate of seed cake she had not asked for, and stood by the estate room door a moment longer than his errand required, remarking that it was a great deal of work for a woman to take on alone, and had she no one to advise her in it. "The Dowager advised me," she said, "before she died." "The Dowager is dead," he said, not unkindly, and left the cake on the corner of the desk, where it sat untouched until the maid cleared it the next morning. She wrote that exchange down too, though it belonged to no column and no sum, because her father had also told her, in that same candlelit voice he used for the things that mattered most, that a thief's kindness is a kind of ledger entry, paid out in advance, against a debt he hopes never to have called. By the second week of January, the figure in her private book had climbed past £200, and she had begun, for the first time, to allow herself the smallest and most dangerous thought a poor woman in her position could permit, not that she might be believed, but that she might, in time, be right. By the third week of January, the frost had reached the estate office itself, creeping along the seams of the window frame until she took to wearing her mother's gray gown over 2 petticoats and a shawl darned so many times it had ceased to resemble wool at all. The steward remarked on this too, in his mild way, observing that a woman who could not keep herself warm ought not to be trusted with another man's fortune. A jest, he called it, when she did not laugh, and repeated it later at the Michaelmas dinner in Ashcombe village, where it travelled from mouth to mouth until it arrived at her own landlady's door, dressed as fact rather than cruelty. She entered it in her book on the 22nd, not as a sum, but as a date, because her father had taught her that rumor moves at a measurable speed, the same as rot, and that a woman who tracked its progress could sometimes outrun it. The false spine gave her nothing more that month. She had gone through it twice, thread by thread, and found only the original pages, damp-spotted, ordinary, but the numbers she had already extracted, rents recorded twice under different hands, a tenant's payment of £11 entered as 3, a repair to the east barn billed at 4 times the mason's own receipt, which she had obtained by walking 6 miles to Aldercot in the rain and asking for it plainly, as a bookbinder's daughter asking after her father's old friend. Those numbers had begun, by the last week of the month, to arrange themselves into something with a shape, not yet a proof, a shadow of one, the way a badly bound book shows the outline of what has been cut from it. The Duke came to the estate room twice that week, both times on some pretext of correspondence, and both times left without asking what she had found. Though she noticed everything, it was the whole of her trade, that his eyes went first to the ledgers stacked at her elbow before they went to her face. He had the look, she thought, of a man standing at the edge of a frozen pond, uncertain whether the ice would hold his weight, or whether he wanted it to. On the 29th, the steward brought her a fresh candle, unasked, and set it down with a care that struck her as rehearsed, and said that a woman so devoted to her figures ought to mind that figures could be misread by those without the schooling to understand them, that numbers, unlike words, could be made to say 2 things at once. She thanked him for the candle. She wrote down the sentence exactly as he had spoken it, word for word, in the margin beside the column marked East Barn Repair, disputed, because she had learned, from binding 100 broken spines, that a man rarely warns you of a lie unless he is standing very close to where it is buried. By the 30th, she had a column of her own, kept separate from the estate's books, in a hand smaller than her working hand, meant for no eyes but hers. She wrote dates. She wrote sums. She wrote the names of barns that did not need repairing, and the names of tenants who had paid twice for the privilege of being told they had not paid at all. £1,100, near enough, in the first 4 years alone. Not the whole of it, she knew, only the part that had not yet learned to hide itself well. She did not go to the Duke with it, not yet. A wound shown too early closes over before it can be cleaned. Her father had taught her that of bindings, and she saw no reason it should be otherwise with men. So she waited, and she worked, and she let the steward believe his candle and his sentence had done their office. On the 2nd of November, the dowager's solicitor came again, this time with a second clerk, and the two of them sat for the better part of an afternoon comparing the rent rolls against the corn prices of the years in question, and said very little, and left with their hats held a shade too carefully against their chests, as men do when they have seen something they are not yet permitted to name aloud. The steward watched them go from the gunroom window. She watched him watching. That evening the housekeeper, a stout, unsmiling woman who had thus far offered her nothing warmer than the correct number of coals for her fire, brought up a plate of bread and cold mutton unasked, set it beside the ledgers, and said only, "You'll want your strength, whatever it is you're doing to that steward's face when he thinks no one sees." Then she was gone before an answer could be required of her, which she thought afterward was its own kind of mercy. By the 5th of November, the rumor had reached the village that the bookbinder's daughter up at Ashcombe was casting her eye toward a fortune not her own, that she had come for figures and stayed for something grander. She heard it first from the baker's boy, delivered with the flat honesty of a child repeating what his elders had said over supper, and she felt the words settle into her the way cold settles into a stone floor, slow and total. She did not deny it. She had learned there was no denying a lie that had already been fitted with a motive by the man who told it. She only went back to her table, drew the candle closer, and began again on the column marked disputed, because the truth, unlike rumor, could not be hurried, and because she suspected, rightly, though she could not yet prove it, that the steward's sentence about numbers saying two things at once had been less a warning than a confession. The ledger for that autumn was thin, but she kept it as she kept all her books, in a hand so even it might have been printed. November 6th, 11 entries reconciled, 2 hours by candle. November 9th, steward absent from the estate office, said to be at market, seen instead riding the north road toward the river. She recorded what she observed and nothing of what she felt, though the two had begun, against her will, to occupy the same page. The Duke did not speak to her again that week, nor the next. He passed her twice in the long gallery, once with the agent from the bank at his elbow, once alone, and both times his eyes went to some fixed point above her head, as though she were a piece of furniture recently moved and not yet approved of. She minded this less than she minded the silence in which the household now watched her, the maids who no longer met her eye, the second footman who had once brought her tea unasked, and now brought it grudgingly, set down with a clatter that was its own small sentence. Only the butler's manner did not change. On the 11th of November he found her in the cold library at 9:30, the fire long dead, her fingers stiff around the pen, and he built the fire himself, without asking leave, an act so far beneath his office that she nearly told him to stop. She did not. She had learned, in 11 weeks at Ashcombe, that some kindnesses were offered, precisely because they could not be refused without cruelty to the giver. "They are saying I came for his fortune," she said, not looking up. "They are saying a great many things," he answered, most of which were said first by a man who has a great deal to lose should the true figures ever see daylight. She looked at him then. 41 years he had kept this house's secrets folded inside his coat, and she understood, in the particular stillness of his face, that he had already guessed at the shape of what she carried in the false spine upstairs, though neither of them had yet spoken the sum aloud. "You believe him a thief," she said. "I believe," he said, "that a man does not spend 11 years insisting the books are dull reading unless he has taken some pains to make them so." She did not answer this directly. She only turned back to the column marked "Disputed," where the numbers sat like a row of closed doors, and began, once more, the slow work of trying each one. Outside, the November rain had turned to something colder, ticking against the glass with a patience that matched her own, and somewhere below in the dark house, a door closed softly, not shut in anger, only shut, and she found she was listening for the sound of it opening again. She found it near midnight, 3 lines above the sum already circled twice in her father's habit of red ink, now hers. A payment of £40 recorded against repairs to the east wall, Michaelmas Quarter, dated the 11th of October, a full 9 days before any mason's bill had been submitted to the estate office, according to the correspondence file she had rebound not a fortnight prior. She sat with this fact the way her father had taught her, to sit with a stubborn spine that would not lie flat, not forcing it, only waiting, turning it in the light until the grain showed which way it wanted to break. She wrote the date on a slip of paper, then the sum, then, beneath it, in her small, close hand, the words, "Before the bill," and underlined them once. The butler had gone. She had not heard him leave the room, so much as felt the room settle after he had, the way a house settles when a weight is lifted from one board and set upon another. She banked the fire herself, an economy she had practiced since childhood and had no wish to unlearn now that the coal was, however briefly, not her own to save. The rain kept its patient ticking at the glass. She thought, not for the first time, that a house in trouble sounds very like a house at peace, if one does not know what to listen for. It was the 3rd ledger of the 6 the Dowager had pressed into her hands the previous May, wrapped in a shawl smelling faintly of lavender and old paper, with the instruction, delivered in that dry, unhurried voice that brooked no argument even at 79, that she was to say nothing to the steward, nothing to the housekeeper, and above all nothing to the Duke, who had enough grief already, without being told his own house doubted him. "He does not doubt you," she had wanted to say then, and had not said it, because it was not yet true, and the Dowager had never once asked her to lie. She had opened that first ledger at her father's old bindery table, the one with the burn mark from a dropped candle in the year of her mother's death, and had found, tucked behind the marbled end paper, a single folded note in a hand she did not yet recognize, 3 words only, unsigned. "Begin with October." She had thought, at the time, it meant the month. Now, with the false spine upstairs holding what it held, and the rain turning colder against the glass, and the closed door below her, waiting to be opened or not opened, she understood it might have meant something else entirely. A year, a person, a beginning she had not yet located but was, slip of paper by slip of paper, drawing steadily nearer. The door below was the steward's study, and the study was locked, and the key, she had learned this in her 2nd week, from the boot boy, who owed her nothing and told her everything, hung on a nail behind the flour bin in the scullery, where no one of consequence ever thought to look, which was precisely why it had stayed hidden there for 11 years. 11 years. She had not known the number yet, not with certainty, not on that particular evening with the rain going to sleet against the glass, but she had begun, some weeks before, to keep her own private column beside the estate's, a 2nd ledger, hers alone, recording not what the steward had entered, but what the tenant rolls said the rents ought to have been. The 2 columns did not match. They had not matched since a date she could not yet fix, though she suspected it clustered somewhere near the old Duke's final illness, when a grieving household stops counting, because counting feels like an insult to the dying. She went down the back stair, rather than the front, because the front stair creaked at the 4th step, and she had learned every fault in that house, the way her father had once taught her to learn every fault in a spine before she touched the needle to it. The scullery was dark. The flour bin was where it had always been. The key was cold, in a way that surprised her, colder than the room, as though it had spent its whole existence waiting to be disliked by someone. She did not use it that night. This was the discipline the dowager had trained into her without ever naming it as discipline. Gather twice, act once. She had seen women ruined for moving a week too soon, and men too, though men were ruined more slowly, and with better dinners along the way. So she returned the key to its nail, climbed the back stair again, and sat once more at the burn-marked table, with the false spine open before her like a wound that had not yet finished bleeding. £400, one entry read, for drainage works never begun. 210, another, for a roof repaired twice on paper and not once in fact. She copied each figure into her own hand, dated it, and did not yet add them, because a sum announced too early loses its power to shock, and she had not survived on a bookbinder's wages by wasting power. Downstairs, far off, a door opened and closed. The Duke, she thought, returning late from the home farm, his boots heavy with a day spent pretending the estate was not what the ledgers already knew it to be. She blew out the candle before he could see the light beneath her door, and think to ask what kept her working past a decent hour. It was October 11th. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, the way her father had taught her to begin every new binding, not with the story it would tell, but with the day the work began, and did not yet know that a year from that date, almost to the week, she would be standing in the great hall, in the same gray gown, signing her name beside his. The house had gone quiet by the time she lit the candle again, cupping the flame with her palm, as though the steward himself might be listening at the keyhole, though she knew he was 3 miles off at the Crown and Thistle, drinking on an account he had likely padded himself. She turned to the ledger's false spine, the one bound not by her father's hand, but by some earlier binder, sloppier, hurried, the glue gone brittle with 40 years, and worked her bone folder beneath the leather with the patience of someone who had spent a childhood learning that haste tore what care could save. The spine gave with a small dry crack, like a knuckle. Inside, folded twice and yellowed at the crease, lay a second set of figures, written in the steward's own hand, dated a decade back, disagreeing with the public ledger by amounts too precise to be error. She did not gasp. She had trained herself out of gasping years ago, the way one trains a hand out of trembling before a difficult stitch. She only sat very still, listening to the house settle around her, a floorboard, a mouse, the far creak of the east wing where no one slept anymore, and began, methodically, to copy the hidden figures beside the public ones, column for column, the way her father had taught her to lay one binding stitching beside another's, to see where the thread had been cut, and rejoined by a different hand. By midnight she had 4 years reconciled. The discrepancies did not waver. They grew, modestly at first, then boldly, as though the steward had tested the estate's attention before trusting it fully. She thought of the Duke's boots on the stair, heavy with a day of pretending, and felt something she recognized as pity, though she did not yet know him well enough to name what else it might become. She banked the fire low, not out, for she meant to return before dawn, and hid the loose page inside her work-basket beneath a half-mended stocking, an old habit, hiding the valuable thing beneath the ordinary one, learned from watching her mother conceal coins in a flour tin. Somewhere below, the butler was making his final rounds, 41 years of them, checking latches that did not need checking, and she heard his slow tread pause outside her door, longer than a servant's business required. She did not open it. She only waited, still as the ledger itself, until the tread moved on. In the morning she would ask, carefully, over breakfast taken alone in the housekeeper's room, how long the present steward had held his post. She already suspected the answer would be longer than was safe for anyone but him. The answer came before she asked for it, which was often the way with true answers. 18 years, the housekeeper said, buttering bread without looking up. 18 years the steward had held the post, and his father before him 9 more, so that between the two of them, the family had kept the estate's books for the better part of 3 decades, unbroken, unquestioned. The old Duke had trusted the arrangement the way a man trusts a chair he has sat in 1,000 times without checking the joints. The housekeeper said this with no particular weight, as though reciting the number of windows in the east wing, and returned to her toast. She wrote the figure down that evening, 18, beside the other figures already gathering in her private book, the one bound in plain calf that no one at Ashcombe had yet thought to ask about. 18 years was long enough for small dishonesty to become a habit indistinguishable from character, long enough for a man to forget he was stealing and remember only that he was owed. By the second week of December, she had traced the false entries through 4 separate ledgers, each more carefully falsified than the last, the hand steadier, the ink better matched, as a forger improves with practice, the way a bookbinder improves with practice, through repetition, through the slow correction of small errors. She admired the craft even as she despised its purpose, and this admiration troubled her more than the theft itself, for it meant she understood the steward better than she wished to. The Duke sent for her twice that fortnight, both times on pretexts thin as the frost on the stable windows, a question about a shipment of vellum, a query about the aunt's correspondence, and both times he stood at the far end of the library with his hands behind his back, asking nothing of substance, watching her instead with the particular attention of a man counting something he has not yet decided is worth counting. "You are managing the cold well enough," he said once, which was not a question, and she answered, "Well enough, Your Grace," which was not quite an answer either, and there the exchange ended, both of them satisfied by the exactness of the nothing they had exchanged. She did not tell him what she had found, not yet. The proof was still incomplete, and she had learned from her father that an accusation offered before its evidence was whole was worse than no accusation at all. It taught the guilty man exactly how much you knew, and precisely how to hide the rest. So she waited, and copied, and hid pages beneath stockings, and listened for footsteps outside her door at night, and told herself the waiting was strategy, and not, in some small, unacknowledged corner of her, simple curiosity about a man who counted her without yet knowing why. By the 19th of November, the ledgers told her 4 separate stories, and none of them agreed. The rent rolls for the Eastern farms showed £112 collected at Michaelmas. The steward's private accounts, kept, she suspected, for his own eyes only, and left carelessly unlocked one Tuesday when he rode to the market town, showed 94. The difference was £18, and £18 was nothing, a rounding error, the sort of gap a careless clerk might explain with a shrug and a claim of spoiled grain. But she had learned from her father that thieves rarely stop at one number. She went back 3 years, then 5, then 11. 11 years, and the gap did not shrink. It widened, quietly, the way water finds the lowest point in a floor no one has thought to check. She did not write the total, not yet. She copied the discrepancies onto a separate sheet, in a hand deliberately unlike her own, slanted the wrong way, the loops too wide, and folded it into the lining of her workbox, beneath the awl and the waxed thread, where a man searching for papers would not think to look for cloth. The steward began, around this time, to linger. He would appear in the library doorway with some pretext, a query about coal deliveries, a question about which rooms wanted airing, and his eyes would go, always, to the shelf where the account books sat, and then to her hands, and then away again, too quickly. He was deferential. He bowed the correct depth. He called her the Miss, with the correct courtesy. But there was a stillness in him now that had not been there in October, the stillness of a man recalculating how much another person might know. On the 22nd, he mentioned, in the kitchens, within hearing of the scullery maid who repeated it to the cook, who repeated it to nearly everyone, that it was strange, was it not, that a bookbinder's daughter with no fortune and no family to speak for her had installed herself so thoroughly in a great house, and stranger still, that the old dowager, God rest her, had trusted so much to a stranger's hands. He did not say, "Fortune hunter." He did not need to. The word arrived on its own, the way damp arrives in a wall long before the stain shows. She heard the whisper second-hand, from the housekeeper, who delivered it with the particular gentleness reserved for bad news one does not wish to be blamed for carrying. She thanked her for the warning and said nothing further, and that night she sat longer than usual over the false spine of the third ledger, running her thumb along its seam, feeling for the give that told her it had been rebound more recently than its cover claimed, feeling, for the first time, that whatever was hidden inside it was closer to her hand than she had understood, and that the steward, whatever he suspected, did not yet know how close. By the 14th of March, she had learned the ledger's habits the way a physician learns a patient's pulse, where it quickened, where it lied. The false spine gave under her thumbnail on the third attempt, a seam no wider than a hairline, glued with a paste too fresh for a book bound, by its own frontispiece, in 1809. She noted the discrepancy in her own hand, in her own small book, dated and initialed, because her father had taught her that an accusation without a date attached to it was merely a rumor with better manners. She did not open the spine that night. She closed the ledger instead, banked the fire, and sat with her hands folded until the shaking passed. Not fear exactly, but the particular unsteadiness of a woman who has found the edge of a very deep hole and understands she must decide, calmly, whether to look down. The following morning the steward asked after her progress with unusual warmth, and offered, unprompted, to have the older account books moved to the muniment room where the light was better. She thanked him and declined, citing her preference for the small study's north window, and watched something behind his eyes recalculate. The butler observed this exchange from the doorway, a tray of untouched barley water in his hands, and said nothing until the steward had gone. Then he remarked, mildly, that the muniment room had not seen a fire lit in it since All Souls, and that a woman might catch a chill there, working alone among old paper, with no one to hear if she called out. She said she had noted that herself. He set down the tray. 41 years I have carried trays into that room, he said, and 41 years the same lock has never once been oiled, though every other door in this house turns like silk. He did not explain what he meant by this. He did not need to. She had already begun, that same afternoon, to keep her notebook on her person, rather than in the desk drawer where any hand might find it. By the 19th, she had confirmed 3 false entries spanning 11 years, each one a small mercy shown to a tenant who did not exist, each mercy paid twice, once from the estate's coffers, once into a pocket she had not yet named. The sums were modest individually. Assembled, they were not modest at all. She wrote the running total at the bottom of her page in pencil, then went back and traced it in ink, as her father had always insisted a true figure should be treated, as a fact, not a guess, once a woman was certain of it. She was not yet certain of the whole, but she was certain enough to understand that whatever she had disturbed by opening that seam had teeth, and that the whisper already circling the kitchens was not misfortune. It was a hand, reaching first. The whisper reached her 3 days later, on the 22nd, carried not by malice directly, but by the housemaid who brought her tea, gone tepid, and would not meet her eye while setting down the cup. Fortune hunter, the word had a shape to it, deliberately blunt, the kind that required no proof, because it asked for none. She noted the date in her book beside the running total, in the same steady hand she used for sums, because she understood by now that a rumor was itself a kind of entry, false, but entered somewhere, and needing to be balanced against. She did not defend herself to the maid. She had learned this from her father, too, that a woman who argues against an accusation before it is spoken aloud has already conceded its power. Instead, she asked, with perfect mildness, whether the steward had called upon the tenant cottages that week, and the maid, startled into honesty, said he had, twice, though rent was not due until Michaelmas. By the 24th she had traced the false entries to a pattern rather than an accident. The same 3 tenant names recurring at 11-month intervals, never varying in the shape of the sum, only in the year. She copied the pattern onto a separate leaf and pressed it flat inside her mother's gray gown's hem, where a seam had already been let out once and could bear a second alteration without notice. It was not a hiding place chosen for cleverness. It was chosen because it was the one place in the house that belonged entirely to her, and to no ledger, no drawer, no desk that could be opened by any hand but her own. The Duke did not speak to her again that week. She heard him once through the library door, his voice low and even with the solicitor from the county town, discussing a mortgage renewal in terms that suggested the estate's difficulties were larger and older than any steward's private theft. Though she was beginning to suspect the two were not unconnected, that a house already drowning invited a smaller drowning within it, unnoticed, the way rot spreads fastest where the timber is already damp. She did not yet have the whole figure. She had, by her own careful reckoning, something near 600 pounds accounted for, and a certainty, cold and exact as the November air coming through the library's ill-fitting sash, that the true sum was many times that. She wrote nothing of this to anyone. She had been hired to bind books and set ledgers to rights, not to accuse a man who had served the house for longer than she had been alive, and she intended to have the whole truth in her hand, ink fixed and undeniable, before she said a single word aloud that could not be unsaid. The rumor, meanwhile, continued its quiet work below stairs, gathering weight the way rumors do, not from evidence, but from repetition. By the 4th week of November, she had begun keeping a second ledger, one that lived nowhere but in a locked drawer of her own lodgings above the bookbinder's shop in the village, a plain octavo, unlabeled, its pages ruled by her own hand, in the same neat columns her father had taught her before she could properly hold a quill. Date, entry. Discrepancy, running total. She wrote nothing that named a name. She had learned that much from her father's trade. A ledger that accuses too soon is a ledger that can be burned, and a woman without a title has no fire brigade to call when someone else strikes the match. The steward, for his part, grew more attentive rather than less. He brought her tea she had not asked for. He inquired, with a solicitude that curdled the moment he turned his back, whether the light in the library troubled her eyes, whether the account books from the 20s were proving tedious, whether she found the work, here his voice always thinned to something almost affectionate, suited to a young woman of her station. She answered him plainly each time, and each time she watched him note her answer the way a man notes the weather before deciding whether to travel. The butler observed this too. He said nothing of it directly, being a man who had spent 41 years learning that the wrong word in the wrong hallway could cost a servant his place, but he began, without remark, to leave the library door propped a half-inch wider than it had stood before, so that anyone passing in the corridor might see her seated there, alone, at honest work, in plain sight of the house. On the 2nd of December, she found the entry that made her set down her pen and sit very still for the better part of an hour. A rent payment from the tenant farm at Longmere, recorded twice, in 2 different hands, 11 days apart, the second sum £8 lower than the first, with no note of correction, no note of anything at all. She copied both entries into her private ledger, word for word, figure for figure, and beneath them wrote only the date, as though the numbers might speak for themselves if given enough silence in which to do it. She did not sleep well that night. The cold came through the thin wall of her room, the way it always did in December, and she lay listening to it, thinking not of the £8, but of the 11 days between the 2 entries, and what a man might do, in 11 days, to make a false sum look old enough to be believed. She rose before dawn, dressed by candlelight in the gray gown, mended once more at the left cuff, the thread not quite matching, and walked the 2 miles to the house, through a frost that whitened the hedgerows, arriving, as she always did, before the fires below stairs had been properly lit. The butler was already there. He was always already there, in the way of men who have kept a house so long, that the house itself seems to wake at his instruction rather than the sun's. He held the side door for her without comment, as he had done every morning since October, and took her wet cloak with the same economy of motion he used for the Duke's coat. No difference in the courtesy, though a considerable difference. Everyone below stairs understood. In the wages, that courtesy cost him nothing to extend. Cold work, he said, meaning the frost, meaning perhaps something else. It generally is, she answered, and went into the small room off the estate office that had become, by no one's official designation, hers. She set the private ledger on the table and opened it beside the estate books, the 2 entries from Longmere side by side under the lamp, and began the work of December the 9th in earnest, tracing every payment from that tenancy back to Lady Day of the previous year, writing sums in columns, checking each against the rent roll the dowager's own hand had kept, before illness took the strength from her fingers. The roll agreed with the first entry. It did not agree with the second. £8 vanished between one Tuesday and the next, and no name attached to the alteration save the steward's own initials, small and neat, at the foot of the page, as though modesty of penmanship might excuse the size of the theft. She did not go to the Duke with it, not yet. She had learned, in 11 weeks of this work, that a single loose thread pulled too soon unravels nothing but itself. A man who has stolen for years does not confess to one entry, he simply learns which drawer to lock more carefully. So she wrote the figure down, £8, the 9th of December, Longmere, and turned the page, and began again on the Michaelmas accounts of the home farm. Because if a man will alter one entry, he will very often, out of a kind of arithmetic vanity, have altered others in the same hand, the same ink, the same season. By noon, the frost outside had burned off the hedgerows, and the light through the office window had gone the pale gold of a winter that had decided, for the moment, to be gentle. The steward passed the door twice that morning, once with a ledger under his arm and a good morning offered too warmly to be entirely without purpose, and once without the ledger, only looking in, the way a man looks into a room to see who is in it, rather than what is being done there. She did not raise her head either time. She had found, in her father's workshop years before, that the surest way to be underestimated by a watchful man was to appear absorbed in something smaller than what she was actually doing, and so she bent over the home farm accounts, pen moving, face giving nothing away, while beneath the desk her private ledger lay closed, the £8 already written down, already waiting for company. By the second week of the month, the private ledger had grown to 11 entries, each dated, each sourced, each written in the same small, upright hand her father had taught her, over a bindery table in another county, in another life. 11 entries, and the sum of them, she had added it twice, once with the window shut, and once with it open, as though fresh air might alter arithmetic, came to £312, 4 shillings, from the home farm alone. It was not the whole of it. She had known that from the start, from the false spine and the figure that would not leave her, but she had learned enough of accounts to know that a thief who has been careful for 11 years does not keep all his carelessness in one place. On the 14th of the month, a Thursday, the steward asked her to dine with the household staff, rather than take a tray in the office, and framed it as kindness. She accepted, because refusal would have been its own kind of confession, and sat at the foot of the servants' table, with her hands folded and her plate barely touched, listening to how the talk turned, as it always did now, to the Duke's temper, and the Duke's debts, and the Duke's late aunt, who had been sharper than any of them had given her credit for, and was missed more than any of them said aloud. The butler, at the head of the table, said nothing on the subject at all, which she had come to understand was itself a kind of statement. She walked back to the office afterward, through a yard gone quiet with early dark, her breath showing white, the cold settling into the wool of her sleeves, the way it settled into old stone. She did not light a second candle. One was enough for the work, and a second would have told anyone watching from the yard that she meant to be there past supper, which she did, though she preferred that fact remain her own. By 9 she had found the 12th entry, a granary rent, recorded at £11 and paid, by the tenant's own receipt tucked behind a later page, at 15. £4, unremarked, in a column that balanced perfectly on its face, and would have satisfied any auditor who did not think to ask a tenant what he had actually handed over at the door. She wrote it down, £316, 4 shillings. She thought, not for the first time, of the figure waiting behind all the others, the one she had not yet dared approach directly, for fear of what approaching it too soon might cost her. £4,380, whole and entire, 11 years compounding in the dark, like interest owed to no one who would ever collect it honestly. Outside, the frost was returning to the hedgerows. Somewhere across the yard a door closed that she had not heard open, and she sat very still, pen lifted, listening to the house the way her father had taught her to listen to a spine before she cut it, for the sound of something already broken, waiting only to be found. The footsteps did not come toward the library, they went instead toward the estate office, where the steward kept his own accounts, in a hand so neat it had fooled 2 auditors before her, and would, she suspected, have fooled a third, had the dowager not been a woman who trusted instinct over penmanship. She counted to 60 before she rose. The candle had guttered low enough that its wax had run over the holder's lip and hardened there. A small white ridge she noted the way she noted everything now, as evidence, however small, of time passing without her permission. She did not go to the office. That was not yet the day for it. Instead, she returned the granary ledger to its shelf, spine outward, exactly as she had found it, and took down the next in the sequence, 1819, bound in a red morocco gone the color of dried blood at the corners. Her father had taught her that a man who wishes to hide something rarely hides it in the volume everyone expects to be examined. He hides it 3 volumes further along, where boredom sets in before suspicion does. She had tested the theory 11 times already that autumn. It had held 11 times. By the 4th page, she found a wool tithe, entered twice under 2 different tenant names, 6 days apart. The second entry in ink, slightly bluer than the first, as though written with a fresh-cut nib on a morning the steward had not expected anyone to compare dates. £2, 11 shillings. She added it to the column in her own book, the private one, bound by her own hands in plain calf with no device on the cover, kept always in the pocket she had sewn into her gray gown's lining, the week she first suspected she would need somewhere to keep a truth that could not yet be spoken aloud. £318, 15 shillings. The number meant nothing on its own. It was the shape of the pattern that mattered. 30 small wounds instead of 1 large one, each too slight to draw a solicitor's eye, each repeated with the patience of a man who had learned, as she had, that patience was the only tool the poor and the dishonest shared in common, though they used it toward opposite ends. She thought of the steward's face across the servants' table that morning, pleasant, incurious, asking whether the old ledgers were proving very dull work, and she had said yes, very dull, and watched something in his shoulders ease at the answer, the way a man eases when he believes the dog has not yet found the buried thing. She closed the red morocco volume. Outside, the frost had reached the window glass itself now, fine as thread, and somewhere beyond it, a cart was moving up the drive, at an hour no honest business required a cart to move. And she stood, listening again, the way her father had taught her, for the sound of something already broken. The cart stopped short of the gravel sweep, where the sound of wheels would carry to the house, and this alone told her more than the hour did. Honest men brought their carts to the front door. She counted 11 days back in her mind, the 11th of the month, the date the quarterly rents were customarily reconciled, and understood that whoever moved in the dark below the window was not delivering anything, but removing it. She did not light a second candle. She had learned that much in 11 months of quiet work, that a lit window asks questions a dark one does not. By the time she reached the servants' passage, the sound had already resolved itself into voices. 2 men, one impatient, one placating, and a third sound beneath them, the particular scrape of a strong box dragged rather than carried. She knew the box. She had catalogued its contents in July, entered its number in her own hand into the ledger she had rebound. £42 in silver, kept apart from the general accounts for reasons the steward had called discretion, and she had called, privately, opportunity. She did not go down. This was the discipline her father had left her, more valuable than any sum she might have named aloud to a magistrate, that the moment to act was never the moment of highest feeling, but the moment after, when the feeling had cooled enough to be useful. She returned to the small room, took up pen and paper by touch alone, and wrote the date, the hour by the mantel clock, the sound of the cart's wheels, narrow gauge, she judged, a tradesman's cart rather than a farm wagon, and the words, "Box removed, not yet missed." She underlined nothing. Underlining was for people who feared their evidence would not be believed on its own weight. Below, the voices ceased. A door, somewhere in the older wing, gave its long complaint, the one that had never been oiled because no one below stairs wished to draw the housekeeper's attention to a door that opened at such hours. Then silence, complete enough that she could hear the frost tightening on the glass, a small dry sound like a page turning very far away. She sat with the paper before her a long while, not from indecision, but from the opposite, from the particular stillness of a mind that has already decided and is only waiting for the body to catch up. 4,380 pounds had been the sum hidden in the false spine. 30 small wounds had been the pattern of the last 2 years. And now a strongbox, 42 pounds, moved by cart in the dark of a frost-bound night, not large enough to matter to the total, and for that very reason, she understood, large enough to matter entirely. She folded the paper twice, the way her father had folded receipts he did not yet wish anyone to find, and placed it beneath the false bottom of her own small trunk. Then she blew out the candle she had never lit, and waited for the house to forget she was awake. Morning came gray and unremarkable, the frost still holding its grip on the lower windows, and she went about her work in the estate office as though the paper beneath her trunk did not exist. This, too, her father had taught her, though never in words, that the appearance of ordinariness was itself a kind of ledger entry, a debit paid quietly against the credit of suspicion. She catalogued 3 bindings that morning, corrected an error of 11 shillings in the tenant accounts dating from March, and said nothing to the butler when he brought in the tea, though she noted that his eyes lingered a half-second longer than usual on the trunk in the corner of the room. At 11 o'clock, the Duke came in from the stables, snow melting from his boots onto the flagstones, and asked, without preamble, whether the quarterly accounts might be ready for the solicitor's visit in a fortnight. She said they would be ready. He did not ask more, and she offered nothing more, and the silence between them had by now the particular texture of 2 people who had learned each other's patience and found it, somehow, restful rather than cold. It was not until the following evening that the strongbox surfaced, not in the ledgers, for it had never been entered there, but in a stable boy's careless remark to the second groom, overheard by the butler while he stood polishing silver that did not need polishing. A cart had gone out toward the mill road 2 nights past the hour when carts had any honest business going anywhere. The butler repeated this to no one but committed it, in the manner of a man who had spent 41 years learning which small facts eventually mattered, to memory. She, for her part, made no move toward confrontation. She had learned this too from her father's ledgers, that a debt exposed too early is a debt the debtor can still deny, but a debt exposed at the precise moment of its completion is a debt no one can argue away. And so she waited, through 3 more days of frost and 1 brief thaw that turned the drive to mud and back to ice again, gathering not accusations but arithmetic, the dates the strongbox had moved, the sums that did not appear against them, the pattern of 30 wounds now numbering 31. On the 4th day, a letter arrived for the steward from the mill road itself, delivered by a boy who did not know to be discreet about where he had come from. The butler saw it delivered. He did not read it. He would never have permitted himself that. But he saw the steward's face upon opening it, and later, when he passed the estate office, he paused at the door a moment longer than was strictly necessary, as though weighing whether the season for silence had, at last, begun to end. The letter, it transpired, had come from a corn factor in the mill road, who had grown weary of waiting upon promises. 18 months, he wrote, since the last settlement of accounts, and he would wait no longer without either payment or explanation, and he trusted the steward of Ashcombe to understand that a man of business could not feed his family on the strength of another man's excuses. It was not a large sum, set against 4,380 pounds, 62 pounds, no more. But it was the 62 pounds that undid what 11 years of larger sums had not, for it was the sort of debt that could not be quietly absorbed into the estate's chaos, the sort that arrived on foot, by a boy who did not know discretion, and announced itself to anyone who happened to be passing the hall on a Tuesday morning in the cold week before Lady Day. She learned of it from the butler, who mentioned it in the manner of a man remarking upon the weather. The steward had received an unpleasant letter, he said, and had gone out directly after in his greatcoat without ordering the trap, walking the 2 miles to the mill road himself, rather than send a reply by hand. This was, the butler observed, not the behavior of a man confident in his position. She said nothing to this beyond a small nod, and went on with the binding she had before her, a book of common prayer belonging to the dowager's own mother, its spine cracked from a fall some 40 years past and never mended, waiting, like so much else at Ashcombe, for someone with the patience to see to it. Her fingers moved with the same steadiness they had kept through 11 months of ledgers and lies. But she noted the date, the 19th of March. She had learned, from her father, that a man's panic has its own arithmetic, and that a debtor, cornered on one side, will often make a fatal move to relieve himself on the other, will dip once more into a well he believes not yet exhausted, not knowing the well has already been measured, weighed, and found wanting by someone he considers beneath his notice. She did not seek out the Duke that evening to tell him what she suspected was coming. She had promised herself, months before, that she would not move before the ledger was whole, and it was not whole yet. There remained one final entry she had not yet been able to trace, a withdrawal from the September before last that matched no rent roll, no repair, no purchase she could find recorded anywhere in the estate's chaotic papers. She meant to find it. She judged, perhaps a fortnight before the steward's panic curdled into something more dangerous than debt. She began with the September entry itself, turning it over the way her father had taught her to turn, a damaged spine before deciding where to cut. A withdrawal of £110, dated the 14th, marked only "Sundry repairs, east wall." She had walked the east wall herself in November, in a hard frost, and found no repair newer than a decade. The mortar there was the same crumbling gray it had been in the dowager's day. A lie, then, but a lazy one, the kind a man writes when he believes no one will ever ask to see the wall. She asked the butler, without explaining why, whether any mason had been sent for that autumn. He answered at once, without needing to consult his own memory, that no mason had come to Ashcombe since the spring before the dowager's death. He remembered it because he had paid the man himself, in coin, from the household purse, and recorded it in his own hand in the daybook kept below stairs. 41 years of service had made him a ledger of his own, though no one had ever thought to consult it. The two entries did not match. £110 had gone somewhere that was not the east wall. She traced it, over 4 days, through 3 false headings and 1 genuine receipt for grain that had been altered, the numeral 3 made clumsily into an 8, the ink slightly darker where the pen had pressed twice. It led, at last, not to a tradesman or a mason, but to a moneylender in the market town, a man named in no estate paper, but known to the grocer, who mentioned him once, carelessly, as the man the steward visited on quarter days, when his own wages, by any honest reckoning, ought to have covered his needs twice over. She did not go to the moneylender herself. She sent, instead, a note to the solicitor, worded plainly, asking whether a debt of that particular kind, a private loan, repaid quietly, out of estate coin dressed as repair, might be proven in a court of law, or whether it would remain, as so much of the steward's work had remained, a suspicion dressed as certainty, and nothing more. The solicitor's answer came back within 2 days, in a hand she had learned to trust. Proof enough, if the receipt could be produced and the moneylender persuaded to speak, though such men rarely spoke without inducement, and inducement was a thing she had never once, in 11 months, allowed herself to offer or accept. She sat with the altered receipt a long while that evening, turning it beneath the lamp the way she had once turned her father's damaged bindings, looking for the place where the thread had first begun to fray. She thought of the 19th of March, and the fortnight she had allotted herself, and understood, watching the numeral 3 sit uneasily beneath its false 8, that the fortnight had already begun to shrink, that a man cornered by 2 debts at once does not wait politely for either of them to be proven before he moves. The fortnight did not survive the week. On the 23rd of March, the moneylender was found willing to speak, not from conscience, but because the steward had grown careless in his repayments, and a man who is not paid on time remembers no loyalty at all. By the 26th, the receipt and the ledger and the 9th of October entry sat together on the solicitor's desk, like 3 witnesses called at last to testify against a fourth. The steward left Ashcombe on the 28th, before dismissal could be formally spoken, taking with him a single trunk and none of the respect he had spent 11 years borrowing against. Which brings the accounting, as all true accountings must, back to where it began. 5 months earlier than that, in the cold light of a November morning, in the great hall of Ashcombe before assembled solicitors and neighbors, and the particular hush that gathers around a man about to lose everything, the Duke had looked at a woman in a mended grey gown and called her presence there charity work, meaning it as dismissal, meaning it to wound, not yet knowing that the gown's very thread would outlast his contempt for it. Now the hall was warm. September light came gold and low through the tall windows, laying itself across the same table where the humiliation had been spoken, where the deed now lay instead. The butler stood where he had stood for 41 years, hands folded, watching. The solicitor held the pen out and did not press it into anyone's hand, merely offered it, as a thing offered is different from a thing demanded. She wore the grey gown. The needle marks at the cuff caught the light when she reached for the pen, small and deliberate, worn on purpose rather than in ignorance of what it had once been called. The Duke's hand rested near the deed's edge. It did not move to cover hers as she signed, nor did hers seek his, only the paper between them, and the ink drying into a name that made her, by the plain language of an ordinary marriage settlement disguised as estate business, joint holder of everything he had once believed he alone must save or lose. He watched the signature settle. Something in his face did the work his mouth had refused for 11 months. "I called it charity once," he said, quiet enough that only the room's 4 occupants heard it. "I was wrong about the dress. I was wrong about a great many things." She said nothing. She had learned, long before she ever entered that hall, that some corrections do not require an answer to be complete. The pen was set down. The ledgers, at last, balanced, not merely in coin, though the figure of £4,380 had been returned in full by December, but in the slower arithmetic of respect, which pays out over months rather than moments, and cannot be forged by any hand, however practiced. Some gowns, the narrator might have observed, are worn twice for the same reason a debt is paid twice, once in coin, and once, far more slowly, in the currency of being final.